Bridgeport.
History was made on today's date. Stay tuned for an American Minute with Bill Federer.
Charles Carroll was unique. He was the only Roman Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he outlived all the other signers. At his death, he was considered the wealthiest citizen in America. On this day, November 4th, 1800, Charles Carroll penned a letter to James McHenry, the signer of the Constitution, for whom Fort McHenry was named. Charles Carroll wrote, "Without morals, a republic cannot subsist any length of time. They, therefore, who are decrying the Christian religion, whose morality is so sublime and pure, are undermining the solid foundation of morals, the best security for the duration of free governments."
This has been an American Minute with Bill Federer. For a free transcript, call American Minute at 1-888-USA-WORD.
VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at VCYAmerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And we thank you for joining us on Crosstalk here on this election eve. The evangelist Charles Finney stated this. He said, "Politics are a part of a religion in such a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to their country as part of their duty to God." He said, "God will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics." Indeed, believers in Christ do have a special role. I call it a stewardship before God of the vote we cast. The Scripture tells us in Proverbs 29, verse 2, "When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn." Elections really do have consequences. Joining us today to discuss what's at stake in our 2024 election, we welcome Jerry Newcomb. He's Executive Director of the Providence Forum. It's a division of D. James Kennedy Ministries. Jerry serves as senior producer and on-air contributor. He's the author of or co-author of some 33 books, including the book that made America, How the Bible Formed Our Nation, George Washington's Sacred Fire, and American Amnesia. Is America paying the price for forgetting God, the source of our liberty? Jerry, welcome back here to Crosstalk.
Thank you, Jim. Good to be with you.
So we're going to talk about what's at stake in this election, but before we get into some of those specifics, many have viewed this election, Jerry, as being pivotal for the very future of our nation. Are we really at such a critical position?
Well, it would seem that way. I mean, there's obviously a very different vision for the future of America as being cast by the two predominant parties. So, for example, I mean, the way conservatives would see it, the Republican side of things is more pro-freedom, pro-religious liberty. We're being accused of being, anti-abortion to the nth degree, but the reality is we do believe there should be some restrictions, like, for example, parental consent for abortions for minors and things like that. The other side wants to see abortions without any kind of restrictions. In fact, Kamala Harris was asked just within the last week or two, well, what about, let's say, Catholic hospitals? Would they be forced to do abortions, if you had your druthers? And she said there should be no restrictions on abortions, which basically means conscience rights be darned. Mm-hmm. And so there's a very different vision for, where the different parties stand on these critical issues, and then there's of course other hot button issues like the economy, the borders, and inflation, which is of course a subsidiary of the economy issue, crime and no punishment in some cases.
Jerry, you have studied this nation for decades, and the founders and founding documents. How did we ever get to this point? I mean, there was one time where there are certain things that were just universally believed, but how did we get to this point of really on a trajectory of socialism or one of, following the constitutional republic which was established?
The short version, the left took over education. That's the short version. Really, beginning in the 1930s, there were efforts by John Dewey, who was a signer and one of the prime movers behind the Humanist Manifesto. There were two versions of that, by the way, one in the 30s and then another one in the 70s. And basically it was along the lines of, we don't need God. Even if there is a God, we don't need him. And so they promoted, a practical type of unbelief in God. And so essentially what John Dewey of Columbia wanted to do was to remove God from the schools for all practical purposes. And then, of course, the Supreme Court, in a series of decisions related to prayer and the Bible and what was allowed for children to hear or read about in the schools, there was just one decision after another where they threw all these things out. And in God's place, they had to install metal detectors. And even that doesn't always work and so forth. I think probably the single worst decision of the Supreme Court in terms of the way they showed their animosity towards the things of God and the historic, roots of America and so forth was, believe it or not, in 1980. So that's 44 years ago, in the Stone v. Graham decision related to the Supreme Court. It was the Supreme Court decision related to the Ten Commandments in the courtroom walls. And they said that if the Ten Commandments are posted I said in the courtroom, I meant the schools. If the Ten Commandments are posted in the schools, the children might read them, meditate upon them, venerate them, and obey them. Now, as much as we may desire that, that is a violation of the Establishment Clause, they said. Well, the founders would never have agreed with such a decision. That is absolutely at odds, with our country, where the president, the first president to every president, every single one, are sworn in on the Holy Bible. They're sworn in saying, "So help me God." In the case of George Washington, the first one, he leaned over and he bent down and he kissed the Holy Bible. And as Dr. D. James Kennedy once put it, "Why, that's enough to give the ACLU apoplexy."
Yeah, so true. Jerry, you wrote a column last week, and what's at stake in the current election? I saw your column invited you on Crosstalk to discuss matters from a biblical worldview. And again, we'll get into specifics in a moment, but I want you to underscore those words, biblical worldview. As believers in Jesus Christ, such a worldview should override all else, should it not?
It absolutely should. And I think that even the atheists, honestly, they benefit because of the biblical worldview. For example, if you're here in America, we still have a modicum of freedom, and that freedom is derived from the Judeo-Christian heritage. So, for example, the essence of the American experiment is self-rule under God. If you read our national birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence, you see it's a theological treatise of sorts. It mentions God 4 times, not in some sort of intangible or some sort of tangential way. It says that God is the source of our rights. And when God is the source of your rights, that means that those rights are non-negotiable. In fact, the whole history of the 20th century, where we saw the rise of these godless nations, like the Soviet Union or the National Workers' Socialist Party in Germany, in other words, the Nazis, or Chairman Mao's China. These were godless constructs, and God was removed from the equation. They did not believe that they would be accountable one day to God. And what ended up happening? Well, they unleashed the gulags. They unleashed, ultimately, the Holocaust. They unleashed all the killing fields and so forth. So this is a repeated pattern where you take away God. God is the sure foundation of our rights. As Patrick Henry put it this way, it is when a people forget God that tyrants forge their chains.
Wow.
And so it's an important point that we remember the God factor in our history.
Jerry Newcomb is with us today, Executive Director of the Providence Forum. Again, that's a division of D. James Kennedy Ministries. Jerry, so let's talk about what's at stake. The very first item you mentioned in your column was the value of human life. And even in a previous column, you also wrote why you vote pro-life. But as again, we're taking a biblical lens through this, a biblical worldview. Comment on this, if you would, the value of human life.
God is the author of life. He says in the Bible in different places where it talks about, I formed you in the womb. David talks about how he was fearfully and wonderfully made, knit together before he even, saw any days. In other words, before he was even born. In the New Testament, we see that the word brephos in the Greek is used to describe baby, but it's used both for a baby in the womb and a baby out of the womb. And you can see that in Luke chapter 1 in reference to when John the Baptist was in utero in his mother's womb in the example of Elizabeth, and John the Baptist leaps for joy inside Elizabeth when Mary comes in, and Mary has Jesus, because of the virgin birth.
Right.
Jesus is inside her, and John the Baptist is excited. But think about that to God, in His Word, a baby is the same whether the baby is born or unborn, or as they say these days, preborn. Bottom line is, God is the author of life. And in fact, in Psalm 127, it talks about how it's, children are a blessing from God. Blessed is he whose quiver is filled with them. But we live in a time where things are just anti-baby. It is anti-children. It's amazing. When I grew up, this is maybe almost a silly anecdote, but it's true. When I grew up, the game of life, the board game that you play, at the end of the game, when you cash out everything, if you had, the more children you had, the more points you somehow received. Right. I forgot whether it was money or points or whatever.
Money.
In other words, it was an asset. It was not a liability. By the time you get to the 1990s or the early 2000s, the same game, the game of life, had been modified so that by the end of your life, the more children you have, it's a liability. Whoa, are you kidding me? And when it comes to abortion, this is the deliberate taking of these, preborn babies' lives. And in fact, I did a recent interview with somebody that used to do that. He is an OB-GYN, Dr. Anthony Levatino.
Oh, yes.
And he did 1,200 abortions, and one day he just realized, I can't do this anymore, because he realized he was deliberately taking human lives, inside the womb. In fact, he testified before Congress about a year ago, 3-minute description. This is what we actually did in a 20-week-old abortion of a 20-week-old child, where we would just dismember them one limb at a time. And, of course, that baby feels all this pain, and it's just awful. It's so barbaric. And people say that they support abortion rights, or they support a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy. Well, they should at least know what it is they're supporting. And I think when we hear from former abortionists like Dr. Anthony Levatino, or former abortion clinic workers, or even managers like Abby Johnson, we get an idea, well, what is it really like inside those clinics? These people say they support this. Well, you should know what you're supporting, because one day God's going to hold you accountable for it. That's why I vote pro-life. It's, God is the source of life. And even if you just take a totally humanistic perspective and say, okay, we're not even going to allow thoughts about God to enter this equation. Do you think it's wrong to deliberately take human lives? Well, look at what they actually do in abortions, and then tell me you don't think that's barbaric. It is barbaric.
It is barbaric, and as you pointed out so aptly, that life does begin at conception, and the scriptures that talk about life before birth and after birth, it's still all baby, it's all human, and so we are also told in Scripture that God hates the hands that shed innocent blood. So, friends, as we talk about a biblical worldview and what's at stake in this election, it's the value of human life. And I saw a quote from somebody here recently saying if Planned Parenthood was killing puppies instead of babies, America would have shut them down by now. And, truly, that's where we are at in this nation. What's at stake, friends, is the sanctity, the value of human life. Jerry Newcomb is with us here today. We've got a quick break, and after the break, we're going to come down and break out some other issues here as to what's at stake in our nation's election. Back in 1 minute, you're listening to Crosstalk, coming your way from the VCY America Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, author and seminar speaker with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, can you use ordinary things as a witness for creation?
You certainly can, Chris. In fact, you can use an automobile or an airplane or a radio station or most design systems to witness to the design and creation. If a radio station needs a designer, then certainly things much more complicated, like life, need a designer. If you know anything about geology, you can use the road cuts through mountains to witness the Noah's flood. You can see the strata, obviously laid down by moving water, and point out that these strata typically go for miles in every direction, maybe thousands of miles, speaking eloquently of widespread deposition due to water action. Yes, indeed, Chris. Creation and the flood are clearly seen from evidence all around us, and we can use them to witness to that back to Genesis truth.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more information, you can find us on the web at www.icr.org.
You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network. Our nation's election, what's at stake? Our topic today, Jerry Newcomb, our guest, Executive Director of the Providence Forum, a division of D. James Kennedy Ministries. And we're talking about the sanctity of human life, the value of human life. And let's also just point out, Jerry, that we know in addition not only to candidates and where they stand on this issue, and we know that there are those, Kamala Harris has talked about how she will sign, federalization of what she calls Roe v. Wade into law here across this land. She wants Congress to pass this and looking for a Congress, House and Senate that are going to support her. But also in addition to this, many state houses are up for election. But there are also 10 states with abortion right on the ballot by means of a state constitutional amendment to change their state's constitution to allow unhinged abortion up to the very moment of birth.
Yeah, it's barbaric, and it's really sad. But I am grateful that at least in the case of Florida, which is one of those 10 states, we have a situation where any amendment to pass in this state has to cross a 60% threshold. So in other words, that gives at least a little bit of a cushion. But I agree with you, and the other side is just pouring gazillions of dollars in advertisements, and they're very deceptive. I mean, I've seen some of these. They're basically saying if there's a rape of a woman in Florida, you can't get an abortion unless you pass this amendment.
You know, the deception is rampant in all these states that are holding this matter here, and it's become the number one issue for many, the right to kill an unborn child in the womb. It is amazing. Jerry, there's a second item you mentioned also at stake, and that's religious liberty. Give us your perspective on that.
America was born for religious liberty. The original settlers, I mean, over and over and over, that was their biggest driving concern. Not every one, but that was certainly the motivating factor, for example, of the Pilgrims or the Puritans, who set out to create a city on a hill, the Quakers that came, or the hundreds of thousands, a few hundreds of thousands of Presbyterians who came in the 1700s. In a population of about 3 million at the time of independence, there were literally a few hundreds of thousands of Presbyterians who came just in that century alone, and it was for conscience rights. It was so that they could freely practice their religion. And now we're in a place where the government just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the federal government, and religious rights are often at risk, especially if you're pro-life or you somehow disagree with the government, and or you disagree, let's say, with the radical LGBT plus
agenda. Yeah, their goals and agenda. Yeah, and Jerry, we found also, and you mentioned it here just a bit ago as well, the whole aspect of granting religious exemptions, to doctors who are convicted that they're. I'll tell you what, we're going to try and reconnect with Jerry again. That line went sour. But Jerry had commented earlier as well about this matter of granting religious exemptions to doctors who are convicted that they are to sustain life and not to take life in the womb. That also is, what's at stake with this matter of religious liberty. Those who will seek no religious exemption whatsoever, you just can't have that. Sorry, you must follow the government. Okay, Jerry, we got you back with us here?
Yes, sorry about that.
Okay.
I didn't realize I was using a phone that was dying, but it was a part of there's other phones in the same system, so I switched over.
Very good.
I didn't realize.
Thanks for doing so. Yeah, that line did die. Okay, so we talked.
But this religious freedom thing is really a critical point. Conscience rights drove so much of the whole push for America to become a place, a haven of religious, freedom. I mean, for example, take the issue of the Jews. Here in America, the founders felt that America would be the sanctuary for the Jews. The favorite verse from the Bible of George Washington, who was a regular reader of the Bible, he used its phrases often. He was also a regular reader of the Book of Common Prayer, the 1662 version, which was very, very orthodox from his native, the Anglican Church, Episcopal in the American version of the name. But anyway, he said that as he looked at Micah 4:4, he thought of the Jews and other nonconformists. It talks about how, this is in the Old Testament, it talks about how every man shall rest under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid. And he viewed America as this sanctuary. Rabbi Daniel Lapin, who is somebody I've interviewed a few different times for different programs and so forth, he loves to say this statement, and he said it on numerous occasions, that in 2,000 years of Jewish history, the Jews have never done better than when they came to America because of the Christian principles. He said that's not despite Christianity, it's because of it. He even said you might say that the Jewish safety belt is the Bible belt. And he said now that we see, the rise of secularism, secular fundamentalism, in fact, is the phrase he uses it, we see that the security and the sanctuary that the Jews have often experienced is no longer the case. We see that Christians are at risk if in any way they run afoul of, like the new sexual orthodoxy, if you will, and that includes the whole issue of abortion, and so it's so funny, Jim. When you get down to it, it's almost like we're really just sort of dealing with the fallout from the 1960s and the sexual revolution and so forth.
Wow. Jerry Newcomb with us today. Jerry, another aspect you wrote about what's at stake in this election, you mentioned Israel. What's at stake here?
Their survival. I mean, let's put it this way. Israel obviously is surrounded by all these different Muslim countries. Some are more nice to them, but some of them basically want to wipe Israel off the map. They don't think they have the right to exist. Every single Friday at the mosque, in Iran, they say, after they say the prayers or after they have the sermon, they chant "Death to America, death to Israel."
Wow.
And they have access to rockets, and they obviously fired a lot of them at Israel within the last year. It is said that they helped in the behind-the-scenes stuff of the attacks on October 7th. They've been attacking Israel since Israel, retaliated to the October 7th attack. And so the Biden-Harris administration has been very wishy-washy in their support for Israel. I mean, for example, when Benjamin Netanyahu spoke before Congress, Kamala Harris chose not to be there, probably not wanting to have the photo op of her sitting right behind him. But in the meantime, she did meet with him privately, but it kind of sent a message, sort of like, well, we're with you, but not fully,
Yeah.
So
well, didn't it also
scary.
didn't it also speak volumes when she bypassed the Pennsylvania governor Josh Shapiro as
Yes.
her running mate, a man who is Jewish?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly right. And it's funny too, because I was talking to Robert Spencer recently, and he said that even Shapiro distanced himself when he was perhaps under consideration to be vice president under Kamala Harris, or for her candidacy, that there was some sort of document he had written about 20 or 30 years ago along the lines of Israel's right to exist or whatever, and he just kind of jettisoned his own report on that. So to be honest with you, I'm very comfortable with Trump, for example, going to Israel and actually moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Many presidents, including Barack Obama, promised they would do this, but it took Trump to actually do it, and he did do it. And some people even see that as, fulfilling a type of prophecy. In any event, bottom line is Trump is supported by 60% of people in Israel, which is not, of course, the case here in America in terms of how many people support him. But there's definitely a commitment on the part of Trump towards Israel. And speaking of that, I do think that the peace through strength idea that Trump has often espoused, but this is something that goes back way, into our history, where George Washington said the best way to preserve the peace is to be prepared for war in case you're attacked. And I think that's true. And in fact, love Trump or hate Trump, it is noteworthy that when he was the president, nobody dared to start a war or to attack America, or the Houthis, attacking America. If you recall, when he first became president, ISIS in the Middle East was a big deal in terms of radical Muslims that were killing a lot of Christians and so forth. And by the time Trump left, they were essentially neutered. They were no longer a threat. They were no longer a force, and some of their key leaders were killed. So people sort of had this respect for Trump, or maybe they thought he was nuts, but they didn't dare attack when he was the president. Same thing even with the Ukrainian war. Putin had attacked parts of the old Soviet Union, parts of Ukraine, etc. He had attacked them under different presidencies, but he did not do that once when Trump was the president. Maybe he thought Trump was too erratic. Maybe Trump was projecting, this sort of, hey, you don't know how I'm going to react type of mode. But bottom line is he definitely projected strength. Peace through strength, to me, makes a lot more sense than these endless wars.
And that's what we heard from Ronald Reagan as well. Jerry Newcomb is with us here today on Crosstalk. And even as we were just talking about Islam just a bit ago, friends, those who follow the Quran recognize that the Quran does call for violence and killing against the infidel, against Jews and Christians. That is basic Islam. Let's get to item number 4 on your list, and that's free speech rights. How will this election make determination on this issue?
Well, we do know that many on the left think that basically free speech should be, limited. So, for example, John Kerry actually said before the World Economic Forum a couple weeks ago, and I wrote a column about it, that, well, frankly, here in America, or in America, the First Amendment is a major roadblock to getting things done that we want to get done. The specific context, he said, it was to fight disinformation. But then the question is, well, what is, who's the one that chooses what is disinformation? One man's truth might be another man's disinformation. Tim Walz said, as far as free speech is concerned, there is no free speech rights for hate speech. Well, who's to define what is hate speech? You, Jim, and I believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, and that's the way God made it out to be. But we don't believe in same-sex marriage. Does that mean that we espouse hate speech. That's the way some interpret it, so we got to be careful with this.
We're going to take a quick break. Jerry Newcomb with us today. Our nation's election, what's at stake? Some more discussion in just a moment. We'll also give you opportunity later in the program to call in. This is Crosstalk, coming your way from VCY America.
When you look at our nation, have you ever wondered, how did we get to this point? Our founders had a reverence for God. They saw His hand of providence in the affairs of men. Morality was revered. How could our nation, founded on God-fearing principles, become a nation that lets ungodliness reign? In the book, Silence Equals Consent, author Bill Federer reminds us that the fate of the world hangs in the balance. He writes, "If you are silent regarding evil, you are giving consent." Bill provides a historical look at the forming of our nation and provides examples showing that when the church was silent, evil took over. He also provides foundational biblical truths which recognize we are here for such a time as this. The book, Silence Equals Consent, is available for a donation of $20 or more by calling VCY 1-800-729-9829.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. We're dealing with our election, what's at stake. Jerry Newcomb with us today, Executive Director of the Providence Forum, a division of D. James Kennedy Ministries, and we're talking about what's at stake in this election. We talked about the value of human life, talked about religious liberty, talked about Israel, talked about free speech rights, and every one of these we could talk so much more. We want to get some more information in here. But, Jerry, just before we go back to this topic here, just give us a word about Providence Forum, if you would.
Oh, sure. Providence Forum was founded by Dr. Peter Lilback. About 15 or 20 years ago, he and I co-wrote a big, thick book about the faith of George Washington. By the grace of God, it became a bestseller. It's called George Washington's Sacred Fire. I must give a shout-out to Glenn Beck. He said on several broadcasts, every American's got to get this book, and he shot it up to number one on Amazon for several days in a row. But anyway, Peter Lilback is the president of Westminster Theological Seminary, and about 4 or 5 years ago, he felt like, you know what, my responsibilities at the seminary preclude me from doing all that I would like to do with Providence Forum. So he generously donated it to Coral Ridge Ministries, and I am the one blessed to be able to carry on the work that he founded. So we make a lot of videos. We make a lot of podcasts. We do a lot of articles. We just do a lot of speaking presentations and so forth, just trying to get the word out about America's Christian roots and why it matters. And if I could, Jim, there's something I mentioned in that article that's directly related to this Providence Forum.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In 2 years, and we might not even think about this, but who's going to be the president, soon, the next president? Well, in 2 years, on July 4th, 2026, America will celebrate the 250th anniversary of our national birth certificate. That is the Declaration of Independence, which, again, says that our rights come from God. Will this be a celebration? Will it be mourning in America, M-O-R-N-I-N-G, or will it be more like mourning in America, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G? There are definitely some Americans who've been so, imbued with the Marxist worldview that they look at America as a terrible nation from the beginning. They look at something like slavery, which is a terrible, terrible thing, but it wasn't unique to America. What perhaps was unique to America was fighting a civil war which killed 700,000 men, and the ultimate catalyst issue of the war was slavery, and it was completely uprooted at such a great cost. But people don't realize the incredible ways the Christian faith helped to influence the positive aspects of America, this experiment. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, for example, one of the phrases used is the consent of the governed. In other words, we the people. In other words, self-rule. And this whole idea that you see in the Declaration of Independence, and then you see with the Constitution, it works out the nuts and bolts of how this government predicated on the Declaration of Independence, which says our rights come from God. How is this government to work? And you see in the Constitution the careful division of power so that no one small group or man, even just one individual, could somehow seize power. The founders definitely believed in what the Bible says, that man is sinful and that therefore power must be separated. But the whole process of creating these two incredible founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, actually began 150 years earlier. It began with the Pilgrims in the Mayflower, the cabin of the Mayflower, when they were blown off course and they were under no government's jurisdiction, and they realized that providentially they were hindered from sailing any further south than they were at the tip of Cape Cod. They made world history by writing an agreement for self-government under God, an agreement of self-rule under God. It's called the Mayflower Compact,
yes.
And it follows the same pattern that you see in the Declaration of Independence
Jerry,
and in the Constitution. In other words, it's a written agreement under God with signatories underneath. And the Mayflower Compact, going 150 years later to the Declaration and the Constitution, there were about 100 or so different, mostly Puritan-type documents of self-rule under God. This is what the American experiment is all about. Os Guinness summarizes it in one sentence. The biblical concept of covenant gave rise to the American Constitution.
Jerry, you've got
Amen.
the makings.
And it all began with those pilgrims and aboard the Mayflower.
And Jerry, you've got makings of several more programs before us as we come back here to what's at stake right now with this election. Certainly that founding and that heritage that we have. We were just talking about free speech rights. Let's get to a next item that you had on your list, which is the transgender issue. We know that this is a hotbed of controversy over the forced acceptance of biological boys playing on girls' sports teams and allowing such to use, the restrooms and locker rooms of the sex that they wish to identify. And you state that this transgender issue is what's at stake in this election. A brief word about this.
Yeah, it's so grossly unfair. I mean, when I think of this, I think of one thing. I think of a volleyball traveling 80 miles an hour and smashing right into the face of a high school girl. The volleyball was just spiked by a high school boy pretending to be a girl or claiming to be a girl so he could play with the volleyball team of girls, and therefore their team could get ahead because, frankly, boys have biological advantages to girls. That's why they even created girls' sports. That girl, by the way, who had that ball smashed into her face going about 80 miles an hour, she suffered a concussion, and her life may be altered for a long time, maybe even forever. And she's just in high school, and this happened a couple years ago in North Carolina. There are a lot of teams now where the girls' teams are deciding, let's say they have to face off against a team that has a transgender student or two or whatever, and they've decided, you know what, we're going to forfeit the game. And in some cases, the school administrators or the sports administrators or whatever come down hard on these girls that are forfeiting the game because of the transgender, because, oh, you bigots, or that kind of thing. No, it's just grossly unfair. It's just the emperor has no clothes. And speaking of that, speaking of having no clothes, they actually force these girls to have biological males go into their locker rooms and share the locker rooms with them. That happened where Riley Gaines, who was a swimmer, and, she practiced 6 hours a day. She was swimming diligently since she was 4 years old, and the 6 hours a day was a college routine. And then she has to compete against a biological male who just basically tied with her, but he got the trophy, not her, because, they wanted to, treat him as if he was somehow at a disadvantage because he was transgender. But the worst part, said Riley Gaines, and she testified before Congress on this point, she said the worst part was having to go in the locker room and just seeing, the full regalia and so forth, and my fellow girls having to suffer with this. And if you complain, all of a sudden you're supposedly a bigot and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, there's no question that the Harris-Biden folks, embrace the whole transgender movement. And, Trump has said he thinks there should be fairness in women's sports, so he doesn't agree. So this is definitely one of the issues on the ballot.
And friends, keep in mind that whoever receives the presidency, gets a nomination, they are the ones who will put into the headship every cabinet-level position. Who's going to lead the Department of Education, for instance? And this is one that is given directions on Title IX that is trying to force this upon schools across this nation. Jerry, you also talk about, and we briefly touch on this, what's at stake is America's true history. We know that's a threat, but the last sentence in your article says this: Christian, don't sit this one out. There's too much at stake. Would you go so far, Jerry, to say that Christians have a duty to vote, a duty not only to their nation, but a duty before God?
Yes, I think so. Because if they don't participate, then the people whose values they would totally disagree with will get in charge. In fact, there's a great quote from our 28th president. Did I get it right? No, I'm sorry. Our 30th president. 28 was Woodrow Wilson. Our 30th president was Calvin Coolidge. And he said, if good men don't hold office, bad men will. It's an either or. And so if good people don't go out and vote, those who don't agree with America as one nation under God will vote. And before you know it, people will be, we'll lose one more freedom after another. Our children will be faced with, a much worse deal in life, and people will be wondering, how did we get to this point? Well, why would Christians sit things out when to me the voice or the vote is so clear? And I will say this: there's tremendous amount of disinformation that comes from the mainstream media. It's just grossly unfair. A perfect example is with that interview that 60 Minutes did with Kamala Harris. The interviewer did a great job, but what they did was they edited, her answers in such a way that made her come off, in a different way. Where in reality, when she actually answered the question he asked her, and then the follow-up questions, she ended up, basically giving word salad type answers. And so they put their fingers on the scale and they pushed down on the scale in favor, of one side, as opposed to trying to be fair and balanced and unafraid in their reporting. And you could see this in the debate where the moderators chose to fact correct Donald J. Trump on at least, I believe it was 5 occasions, and some of their fact checking turned out to be false. So it's like, oh boy, this is just crazy. So you really have to seek alternative sources of information.
Friends, we thank you for tuning into Crosstalk as an alternative source for information. And we are opening our phone lines here today at 800-733-9829. Your questions or comment for our guest today. We've got just a brief number of minutes left. 800-733-9829. And listening friend, I want you to see that the importance, and Jerry, we have just lightly touched over so many issues as to what's at stake in this election. Keep in mind, our borders are another issue of what's at stake and the safety and security of the nation. What's also at stake is the nomination of judges to the federal bench and to the Supreme Court, believing that the next president will be making nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. And friends, I have seen where homosexual advocacy groups are doing all they can right now to get out the vote, to support candidates that will further the LGBT agenda. I see abortion groups that are doing all they can. They're spending great sums of money to support candidates that advocate the killing of the preborn children. Those who want to see Christianity removed from society are active and vocal. The question is, will Christians vote? We'll be back in 1 minute. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewtube.com. Here we are, one day before the election, November 5th, 2024. And depending on the pollster you listen to, it is neck and neck. But others are saying it's going to be like 1980 with Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter. But then again, we have others saying that voter fraud is all over the nation, particularly with people taking real ballots and then voting for people that don't really exist. Phantom voters, if you will. But we do know this, Washington State, Oregon, Nevada, they have activated their National Guard. And in Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, and other cities, they are boarding up the shops. So, my friends, I don't know what's going to happen. But I'll say this, aren't you thankful that God is providential? He has his perfect will and then his providential will. Whatever happens, we know that God is ultimately going to use it to accomplish his ultimate purpose. Hopefully, this could be the finest hour for us as Christians.
Jerry Newcomb, our guest here today on Crosstalk, our nation's election, what's at stake. Our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. We're going to go right back. Oh, just before we go, Jerry, you've got a website you can refer people to?
ProvidenceForum.org.
ProvidenceForum.org.
And I'm really excited about the Foundation of American Liberty film series that we made. It's a 7-part series, 1 hour each, and I've broken a lot of the information down into small little videos, but at ProvidenceForum.org you can see how to see them. Some of them even have a link directly. You can just watch it right on the website if you want, including The Pilgrims, The City on a Hill, The Beginning of Wisdom, which is all about education, George Washington, The Road to Independence, We the People, Endowed by Their Creator. So those are the 7 different videos.
ProvidenceForum.org. Great. Let's go to Scott in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Scott, you're on the air.
Yeah, I have a comment. The factors that have moved us away from the traditional America are the expansions of executive authority, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, the 1913 centralization of power, the 1923 founding of the Frankfurt School and its cultural Marxism, the New Deal, and the movements of the 1960s.
Thank you for that.
There's a lot of input in that. There's a lot of truth in what he just said, and especially, you know, the influence of the 60s. But he mentioned the Frankfurt School. Cultural Marxism absolutely has done a number on us. And then cultural Marxism, that's the woke agenda. That's really what it is.
We have James from Skaney, Michigan. James, you're on the air.
Hello. I'm a former UAW chairman in a plant of 1,100 people. Mm-hmm. And I want to tell people that the unions will mislead them. They were formed by socialists and communists, and they were a great benefit to the working people. But they were the ones that were smart enough to realize in the first place that collective bargaining was necessary for people to have a good life. And on that basis, they built power. They have used the union membership as a voting bloc. In the past, I refer to Jimmy Carter area, where we put stickers on all the bumpers of our cars saying, "Stop Big Oil's Big Lie." The fact is that big corporations like Standard and so on, they imported their oil. The tax was only on internally produced oil, and so they used the membership of the unions to actually drive out 3,000 independent oil producers located in the country.
James, thank you. And I'm sorry for sake of time, we do need to move on. But as a former union leader, you're finding much deception from the part of the unions. It's an interesting observation here, Jerry.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's a very interesting point. And, in fact, you see in this current election, you see a situation where historically a lot of times the unions would directly endorse the Democrat candidate. In this case, they apparently have chosen not to, at least some of the major unions, because there are just too many of the rank-and-file members that like Donald Trump. You know, you look at the example with the driving the the garbage truck last week, or driving in a garbage truck last week, or working at McDonald's. He is definitely working, I think, to or going into the barber shop in Harlem or wherever that was in New York, trying to basically identify with the working man.
Let's go to Mark in Newark, Ohio. Mark, you're on the air.
Yeah, I just want to issue a warning to those Christian voters that if they don't get out and vote, and if they don't help Trump get in this office, and if Harrison gets in, it's your fault, our fault for letting this happen. And you've seen what they did in the 4 years they've been in, and you want another 4 years with them too? Well, if you do, you go right ahead and do what you want to do. But I'm not going to be the one that's going to have that on my shoulders because I voted early, and I'm a Christian.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And let me squeeze in Julie from Pensacola, Florida, our final caller today. Julie, you're on the air.
Yes, another thing that's at stake right now is our military.
Yes.
And the strength and the lives of our military men, just not only the strength of our military, but the lives of the military men and the lives of the people in the other countries, across the pond or whatever, Ukraine and all those other countries that are at war, Israel, because when we hire Trump back in his office, we're going to let him do his job, and he is great at making peace through strength.
Thank you, Julie.
If we just let him do his job, we would have peace.
Thank you, Julie. And the military is another great example here, Jerry, because right now we have a military that sees the archenemy as being global climate change and putting in, the DEI initiatives as well. And she brings up a great point about the military also being at stake.
Yeah, and that's why the recruitment to the military are down. They're way down because, I'm sure you've even seen ads where they used a drag queen or something like that in an advertisement to get more people to join the Navy. And it's not cutting it, and it shouldn't. They shouldn't be doing this. And so there's got to be more normalcy. But this peace through strength idea is extremely important because, basically when you don't have that and you just have feckless leadership, then bully nations will bully those around them. What will happen to Taiwan in the next few years? Well, that really, I think, boils down to how America votes tomorrow.
Jerry Newcomb, our guest here today on Crosstalk. And, Jerry, the bottom line, there's a lot at stake on riding on this election.
Yes, there is, and I think it's imperative that Christians go out and vote. Dr. D. James Kennedy, my mentor, used to say, it is a sin not to vote. It's a sin of omission. He said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's.
Jerry, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, thank you.
Jerry Newcomb, our guest here today on Crosstalk. Again, the website, providenceforum.org. providenceforum.org. He is the executive director of the Providence Forum, which is a division of D. James Kennedy Ministries. There is much at stake in the election tomorrow, and friends, we also encourage and have been encouraging meaningful prayer for this election, and to bathe this election in prayer, and also to exercise your responsibility as a believer in Christ, the stewardship that you have of the vote that you have as well. And again, as we started out, we understand the importance that it is righteousness that exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. God bless you, friends. Thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Take Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.